If you walk into the Royal Mummies Hall in Cairo today, you will find yourself staring at the shriveled, preserved face of a man who died thousands of years ago. His skin is tight against his skull, his teeth are exposed in a frozen grimace, and his body is locked behind reinforced glass. Millions of tourists walk past him every year, snapping photos, whispering about the wealth of the ancients. But very few realize that they're looking at the man who once stood on the highest balcony of the world and declared, "I am your God." This is the terrifying true story of the Pharaoh of the Exodus, a man who possessed the most advanced army, the deepest gold mines, and the most colossal ego in human history. He was a king who went to war with the forces of nature, and in doing so became the ultimate lesson in human arrogance. But to understand his fall, we must first understand the darkness of his rise. This isn't just a story about ancient history, it's a psychological autopsy of power. Ancient Egypt was the superpower of the old world, a civilization of impossible grandeur. It was the Silicon Valley, the Wall Street, and the Pentagon of its time, all rolled into one. But its economy was built on a dark, bleeding secret, a massive population of slaves known as the Israelites. Pharaoh didn't just enslave them, he dehumanized them. He treated them as a commodity, a biological machine used to carve the massive stones that would house his ego. He feared them because he knew that a suppressed giant eventually wakes up, and even the most solid throne is built on the sand if its foundation is the suffering of others. And then the nightmare began, the kind of nightmare that changes the course of 1,000 years. The king woke up in a cold sweat one night, haunted by a vision that felt more real than his palace walls. He saw a blinding fire sweeping from the holy lands of Jerusalem, a fire that behaved like a living predator. It didn't burn the desert, it leaped across the sands, entered the gates of Egypt, and systematically incinerated every Egyptian home, every temple, and every palace. Yet strangely, it left the mud brick slave huts of the Israelites untouched. Shaken to his core, Pharaoh summoned his high council, the astrologers, the sorcerers, and the scholars of the occult. The air in the throne room was thick with the scent of incense and fear. They delivered a chilling interpretation. A child is born tonight among the slaves. He is not a prince of gold, but a prince of destiny. He will take your crown, shatter your idols, and crush your empire into dust. Panic is a dangerous thing in the mind of a tyrant who thinks he is a god. Pharaoh didn't just increase security, he ordered a state-sponsored genocide. He commanded his soldiers to tear through the slave quarters and slaughter every newborn male. Imagine the atmosphere in Egypt during those dark months, the sound of iron boots on stone, the breaking of doors, and the gut-wrenching wailing of mothers. Pharaoh thought he could kill a prophecy with a sword. He thought he could outrun destiny. But he didn't realize that by trying to stop the prophecy, he was actually building the very stage for its arrival. In the middle of this bloodbath, a mother did something that defied all logic. Guided by a divine instinct, she placed her newborn son into a fragile basket and cast him into the Nile River. To any observer, it was a suicide mission. The Nile was filled with crocodiles and dangerous currents. But here is the hook that proves history has a sense of irony. The river didn't float the boy out to sea, it carried him gently, almost purposefully, right into the private bathing pool of the pharaoh's own palace. The tyrant's wife found the boy. She didn't see a threat, she saw a miracle. Pharaoh, the man who had just murdered thousands of babies to kill one specific child, ended up adopting that very child into his own family. He named him Moses. He fed him the finest food, clothed him in royal silk, and taught him the art of war and statecraft. For decades, Moses grew up as a prince of Egypt, never realizing that the man he called father was the butcher of his people. Moses lived a life of ultimate privilege, walking the halls of power oblivious to his true identity. But the soul has a memory that the mind forgets. Blood calls to blood. One day, while visiting the construction sites where the Israelites were being worked to death, Moses witnessed an Egyptian overseer brutally beating a slave. Something inside Moses snapped, a primal roar of justice. He struck the overseer, killing him instantly with a single blow. In that split second, the illusion of his royal life shattered. He was no longer a prince, he was a murderer and a traitor. He fled into the harsh, unforgiving desert of Midian to escape the executioner's blade. For 40 years, the Prince of Egypt became a nobody, a shepherd lost in the shifting sands. This was his transformation. The desert has a way of stripping a man of his ego, preparing him for a burden he cannot yet imagine. On a dark, lonely night at the base of Mount Sinai, Moses saw a fire that defied physics, a bush that burned with a fierce emerald light but was not consumed. From that unearthly fire came a command that made his soul tremble. Go back to the monster who calls himself God, and tell him to let my people go. Moses was terrified. He was a man with a stutter, a man with a price on his head, standing against the most powerful empire on earth. But he was told, I will be with you. Armed with nothing but a wooden shepherd's staff and his brother Aaron, Moses walked back into the halls of power. The confrontation in the throne room was cinematic. Pharaoh looked at this old shepherd with genuine amusement. I am the Lord of the worlds, Pharaoh laughed, his voice echoing off the massive gold statues of himself. Who is this God you speak of? I do not know him, and I will not release my property. To him, Moses was a ghost from a past life, an old man playing with a stick. But Moses didn't argue. He threw his staff onto the polished marble floor. In a terrifying blur of motion, the wood twisted and morphed into a massive living serpent, its scales shimmering with an otherworldly light. The court gasped. Pharaoh's eyes widened, but his pride was a fortress. Magic, he screamed. Cheap street tricks. He challenged Moses to a duel against Egypt's greatest sorcerers. But when the sorcerers threw their ropes and made them appear as snakes, Moses' serpent didn't just compete, it hunted. It devoured every one of the magician's illusions. The sorcerers fell to their knees, weeping and shouting, "We believe in the Lord of Moses!" But Pharaoh stood tall, his heart hardening. He was about to make a mistake that would cost him not just his kingdom, but his soul. He declared war on the divine. What followed was not a war of swords, but a systematic, psychological, and physical deconstruction of a superpower. Pharaoh refused to yield, so the universe itself turned against him. The first blow struck the lifeblood of the empire, the Nile. Moses struck the water, and the mighty river turned into thick, coagulated blood. Imagine the horror, millions of gallons of fresh water turning into a red, metallic sludge. The fish died and floated to the surface. The stench of rotting death covered the entire land of Egypt. People dug wells only to find red horror bubbling up. Pharaoh's pride cracked, but it didn't break. "It is a trick," he lied to his people. So the second wave hit. Frogs, millions of them. They swarmed out of the bloody river, covering every inch of the city. They were in the beds, in the ovens, in the royal shoes, and in the food of the nobility. The sound of their croaking was a deafening 24-hour torture. Then came the lice, itching and biting every man and beast until people were clawing at their own skin. Then the flies, turning the sky black and spreading disease. Then the livestock began to drop dead in the fields, the wealth of Egypt rotting under the sun. Then painful boils broke out on the skin of every Egyptian, making it impossible to sit or stand. Then came a hailstorm of fire and ice, a weather event so violent it crushed the trees and the crops. Then the locusts descended, a living carpet that ate whatever green was left in the land. Finally, a darkness fell, a supernatural, thick darkness that for 3 days was so heavy that no Egyptian could see their own hand. It was a darkness of the soul. With every plague, Pharaoh would beg for mercy, crying out, "Stop this and I will let them go." But the moment the pain stopped, his narcissism returned. He was gambling with the lives of his people, convinced he was the hero of his own story. But the final plague was the breaker of men. Death walked through the streets of Egypt in total silence, taking the firstborn son of every house, from the prisoner in the dungeon to the pharaoh on his throne. The sound of grief that night was so loud it could be heard across the borders. Broken, defeated, and mourning his own son, Pharaoh finally screamed, "Get out! Take your people and leave my sight!" In the dead of night, the massive exodus began. Hundreds of thousands of slaves, carrying their few belongings and their children, walked away from centuries of bondage. They headed toward the Red Sea, tasting freedom for the first time in their lives. But as the sun rose, Pharaoh's grief turned into a cold, burning rage. He looked at his empty city and realized his free labor was gone. His ego whispered one last lie: "You can still catch them." He gathered his elite chariots, the tanks of the ancient world, and thundered into the desert. The ground shook as the most powerful army on earth charged toward a group of defenseless families. The Israelites reached the edge of the sea and stopped. They were trapped. Blue, deep water in front of them, and a cloud of dust and iron death behind them. "We are dead," they screamed. "Why did you bring us here to die?" But Moses stood at the water's edge, calm amidst the absolute panic. He raised his staff. The wind began to howl with a sound like 1,000 freight trains. And then the impossible happened. The sea didn't just recede, it ripped apart. 2 towering walls of water rose up, defying gravity, creating a dry canyon through the ocean floor. The Israelites rushed into the path, walking on the seabed with walls of water shaking like mountains above them. Pharaoh arrived at the shore. He saw the miracle with his own eyes. Any rational man would have turned back, realizing he was fighting a force that controlled the stars. But a narcissist cannot accept a reality where he is not the center. Pharaoh drove his chariot onto the seabed. "I will conquer the sea," his heart screamed. He led his army deep into the corridor of water, but as they reached the middle of the ocean, the trap was sprung. The wheels of their chariots began to break off. The horses panicked and threw their riders. Pharaoh looked up and realized the walls of water were trembling. The divine protection had lifted. On the far shore, Moses lowered his staff. The ocean, held back for hours, collapsed with the crushing force of 1,000 tsunamis. The screams of the elite Egyptian army was silenced instantly by the weight of the water. Pharaoh, the man who claimed to be eternal, was tossed around like a piece of driftwood. In his final, terrifying moments, as the cold, salty water filled his lungs, the mask of divinity fell off. He was just a man, drowning in the dark. He gasped his final words, "I believe in the God of Moses." But it was too late. Belief in the face of certain death is not faith, it is desperation. The water claimed him. But the story has one final haunting twist that sends shivers down the spine. The Quran tells us that God commanded the sea to spit Pharaoh's body out, so that you may be a sign for those who come after you. While his army rotted at the bottom of the ocean, Pharaoh's body washed ashore, perfectly intact. Thousands of years later, in the 19th century, his mummified body was discovered. Today, he doesn't sit on a throne. He lies in a glass box in a climate-controlled room in Cairo. He wanted to be worshipped forever. Instead, he has become an eternal museum exhibit, a silent, shriveled warning to every person who thinks they are above the law of the universe. He is the man who thought he was God, preserved forever to prove that he was only a man.